So welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the church of Smyrna. It's the second church that Jesus addresses. Like Ephesus, Smyrna was also one of those first cities, one of those large cities. It was also a Roman commercial center. It was a port city, right? So a lot of trade was happening in and out of this city. This would cause a dense population and a lot of foot traffic through this city, as this became kind of a gateway into Asia for a lot of Europe and vice versa. Because of the high foot traffic, it would seem that Rome decided to use this city as kind of a stepping point for this area of the world and use it to enforce a lot of their thinking, their ideas, and other things that they wanted this part of the world to know. We see things like public humiliation, torture, restricted economic access for those people who were not abiding by the religious standards of Rome, which at the time were worship the emperor, which obviously we know a Christian's not going to take part in. Due to these conditions, the church here in Smyrna would have been heavily persecuted. As I read about this church from other sources, from the historical point of view, it's argued by some that Smyrna may have been one of the most persecuted churches in history, right? Some of these others may have been similar, but due to the things they were facing, some of the very difficult persecution, the torturing, the public humiliation that I mentioned was happening here in Smyrna at a heavy amount. These people had a very tough time of it, which is interesting in light of what Jesus has to say to them. Let's go ahead and read that address. Kevin, would you read that for us this time?
Sure. Revelation chapter 2, we're going to begin verses 8 through 11. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and who has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Cody, I was just thinking on your introduction there, that was a great background of Smyrna. I understand as well, Smyrna was one of the first cities that actually erected the temple to the cult of the city of Rome, and that ties in to your comments in the opening and good background for the letter as well. So they were definitely heavily persecuted for not participating in the normal practices of Caesar worship. Rome didn't care if you believed it or not, but if you didn't practice it, you suffered, and that's why I think of this idea of they were poor, right, because of that, right?
Exactly, and that temple and those things happening in Smyrna, like we said, is likely due to the foot traffic. We'll get to it later, but when we see Pergamum, we'll see in that city the koinon being there, right? That group who was responsible for enforcing this, they were using Smyrna for this reason. Let's make a spectacle out of anyone who is not worshiping the emperor, and let's use it to teach a lesson, right? And some of that, like we said, was some very graphic things. But one of the other things that these people would have faced was the economic difficulties, right? These people would have struggled to do business in the marketplace. They were branded as traitors to the empire, as people who were not faithful, who had not pledged their allegiance, and who would be treated that way. So these people would have been very poor physically, which gets to the first thing that Jesus has to say to them about the good things is, I know your poverty, but you are rich. Let's stop and talk about that for a second, right? This idea that these people who are so poor are being told by Jesus that they're rich. Obviously, I think that richness would be a spiritual one. In 2 Corinthians 6:10, it says, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet rich, having nothing, yet possessing everything. That seems to be that same kind of contrast that we're talking about here. Having nothing, yet possessing everything. Philippians 4:19 writes, and my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus, right? I think there's the riches.
Right.
Riches in Jesus.
I find it interesting the contrast we see of the church here at Smyrna being called poor but rich. When we get to Laodicea, they're rich, but they're dead.
Exactly.
And that ties into your point, Cody. He's talking about being rich spiritually right? Having that expectation of that crown of life and the reward. And so even though being persecuted and the tribulation they were going through, the poverty they were living, they were still yet rich spiritually, which is a great lesson for us today as we think about our situation in life.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned that verse in Philippians 4, right? Paul is talking to those people about the gifts and the things they've given to him, talking about physical wealth that they have given up, and saying that God would return to them riches in Christ Jesus. Obviously, this doesn't present the idea that God's going to give them one for one every penny, every dollar that they gave away. But this idea that their good works, the things they were doing, and giving away their physical wealth would be returned with wealth in Jesus, right? Obviously, a figurative thing there. That the investment that they're making in Paul at that time would return a spiritual value for them, which is obviously what's most important. It was according to the riches of the glory in Christ Jesus, is what Paul wrote. And I think that's very similar here, helps us frame what's being talked about here with Smyrna. That these people had nothing financially, for most of these people, or very little. But what they did have in Jesus held a very significant value. The work of this church was flourishing, and the reward would be great as a result.
Yeah, and they had something. The church here had something that the people of Smyrna there could never have. And tying back into your Philippians 4 context, in verses 6 and 7, it talks about the peace that can be had as a Christian, right? As one following after God. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have peace on this earth. That doesn't mean we're going to be not suffer persecution. As we try to live as Christians, we probably will suffer persecution, Paul wrote to Timothy. Yeah. Right? But we have Christ. We have the promise of the help from Christ. But we have this peace. That's that spiritual peace of knowing that it doesn't matter, right? In the end, we have what we desire.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I think, a takeaway for us is, amongst many things, I mean, we're not persecuted to the degree that they were, right. But, it can be very easy for us to get caught up in the worldly things that it seems Smyrna avoided, like the money, right? Not having money. If I don't have money, I can't afford the things I need to survive. That stresses me out, right? That makes my life difficult, and sometimes that can affect me in my faith, where I get so focused on my work and now what kind of raise I can get, how much time do I need to put in to get to that point. But what effect does that have on the spiritual wealth that I could be gaining? All right, it makes me think of Jesus in Matthew 6 talking about storing up treasures in heaven, mm-hmm. and not storing up treasures that moth and rust can destroy. Right? It can be very easy to lose focus, especially when you are poor, and start focusing too much on the wrong kind of treasures, the wrong kind of riches.
Yeah, I agree. We are really in poverty if our only measure is of our material wealth. And that's the reference to
exactly.
Matthew 6 you make. And, as we think about, now he's writing to the church, but if we think about how this individually impacts me, I think of, the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man that built the bigger barns. Those guys are rich, but what? They were poor.
Exactly.
Right? Versus maybe the poor widow that cast in her living,
yeah.
If you will. So to your point there.
Yeah, but these are not issues that Smyrna was having, right? They weren't letting that shake their faith. They weren't letting those financial issues and things get in their way, because Jesus says they were rich, right? They were focused on that. They were doing good things, and they were doing good work in spite of what I think is another real important thing to talk about with Smyrna. Like we mentioned, they were going through bad stuff. Like, people were being killed in this city for not following the empire and those religious ways. Christians would be on target because of the way they lived and the priority they would have given to God over the empire. These people were going through hard things, but very similar to the first church that we looked at with Ephesus, they were enduring. They were persevering and holding strong and remaining faithful.
Yeah, I find it interesting as well, Cody, as we'll talk about Smyrna, and of course, as we talk about Philadelphia, we see another element involved here you have the Roman persecution for those things that we've been mentioning, but also it talks about blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not.
Yeah.
So here they have it from, of course, from Rome for the things that you've already mentioned, but here you have it from those who say they are Jews, or maybe they were helping stimulate the Romans to persecute the Christians. So they were getting it from both sides. Those that should have been more understanding of God and His will, and of course the worldliness side of it from Rome.
Exactly. The faithful Christians would have definitely been in the minority, right. Would have had so much stacked up against them, and would have been tested, as Jesus says, tested and tried for. He says tested and tried for 10 days, just meaning some people would go through an absolute and complete testing of their faith, to the point that some people might die. And we know some people were being killed.
Absolutely.
You know, it's interesting, one of my favorite verses, probably in the whole Bible, is verse 10. One that many people know, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Probably one of the most quoted verses from the book of Revelation, but one that I think we often quote while missing the context, right? This isn't Jesus saying, be faithful from now until that day you die way in the future. It's be faithful in the face of death, which for some of these people could be the next day.
That's right.
Or that very day, where these people were actually facing that kind of threat. Like you said, maybe from many different places, but that was a very real thing. Be faithful even if your life is put on the line. Because for some of these people, it would be. Let's move on. Let's talk about what Jesus has to rebuke these people for. I think it goes without saying, Jesus doesn't have much to rebuke them for. I don't see anything. Do you see anything?
No, it's clear to me that there was nothing to. When we talk about Smyrna and Philadelphia, we know that nobody is perfect, but here it's clear that the Lord had nothing to bring their attention.
Correct.
That was affecting the fellowship that He had with His congregation, right?
Exactly. Not that sin wouldn't have existed amongst anyone there. There definitely would have been sin amongst individuals, but as a congregation, they were doing good work. Jesus saw nothing to be addressed publicly. That's got to feel good, right? If you're in the group of Smyrna reading this letter for the first time, it's a little bit of a sigh of relief, right? He doesn't have anything to rebuke us publicly for. Obviously, be careful. Don't let that go to your head.
Right.
But obviously, that would be the goal for us, right? If we received that letter from Jesus, we would hope that our good deeds and the things that were taking place amongst us would cause Him to not have anything to rebuke us for. That would be a huge morale boost, I would think, for the people of this congregation, right? As difficult as things are going, Jesus is confirming what you're doing is good, and you're doing it well, at least as a group.
Yeah, if we all had our values straight, like maybe Smyrna and we talk in Philadelphia, right, and think about what they had waiting. They were rich, according to the standards of wealth, because they had that crown of life waiting, right? The value of being a Christian was, of course, our eternal reward. There's just one other thing that I find interesting, Cody, as we think about this. The idea of tribulation, isn't it interesting? The Lord knows their troubles, but He didn't promise to remove them. In fact, He tells them they're going to suffer a little bit more, this outside pressure, right, that comes from tribulation. And I can't help, as you mentioned, these words are written for a purpose to these churches, and the book of Revelation as a whole is an encouragement. John already told them, I'm your brother in tribulation. Where was John sitting? Right? In the Isle of Patmos.
Yep.
And here we see this tribulation that they were going through. Commended for what they were doing, but yet still going to have to suffer for the things of Christ.
Exactly. And I think that naturally shifts our conversation into the things Jesus has to counsel them on, right? Since He didn't have anything to rebuke, He immediately shifts there. I think it's interesting, like we've talked about. In verse 11, He says, He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Right? That kind of gets to what you were talking about, is here's what Jesus is promising. Right. Your eternal soul is what's safe. Right. Your physical life here on earth is not. Right. And they needed to realize that. And we would need to realize the same thing, that we could be killed because of our faith. We could have all of our physical belongings taken away because of our faith. We might go through very difficult times on this earth as a result of being faithful to God. but God is promising something better after this life. And I think he's offering that to them as counsel to say, I'm coming to help you, but let's recognize what I'm coming to do. This may not get easier in some of your lives. Some of you might go through that absolute, total tribulation.
Yeah, that idea of overcoming, that word that's used there is the same root is where we get victory, or the same typical word is victory. That's how we're victorious. The overcoming, the victorious. We're not. There's so much meat and discussion we can have on the second death, but yes, our eternal soul is at stake, and that second death, if we're not going to be hurt by that second death, again, that just points to the reward after judgment.
Exactly. So as we come to the end of this section on Smyrna, I really think Jesus is wanting their takeaway to be, your reward is safe, right? You're going to go through some hard stuff, but your eternal reward will not be taken away from you if you remain faithful. So remain faithful.
Right.
Right. That's the message to Smyrna, is you're doing good, keep doing good, don't stop. But with that, we will stop talking about this church and we'll go ahead and move on to our next one.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook for more content like this.